Linda Parker thought she was calling the police about a simple burglary, but when detectives traced the missing box back to her late husband's secret past and to a man who vanished 20 years earlier, her quiet life in Maple Hollow unraveled into a web of lies, greed, and a truth far darker than she ever imagined. It was one of those still, ordinary evenings in Maple Hollow when everything suddenly shifted from calm to chaos. The town was quiet, tucked under a blanket of autumn fog, when the police dispatcher picked up a trembling voice on the line. Linda Parker, a middle-aged widow who lived on the edge of town, reported that someone had broken into her house. She sounded more confused than scared, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. Officers were sent out right away, thinking it would be a routine call. After all, Maple Hollow wasn't known for crime. Most of their calls were about missing pets or noise complaints. A burglary was rare. When officers arrived, Linda stood in her driveway, clutching her phone like a lifeline. She explained that she had gone out to dinner with friends and returned home just after 9. The porch light was on, but the front door was slightly open. That immediately struck her as odd, since she remembered locking it before leaving. Inside, the house was a mess, drawers pulled open, cushions tossed aside, a few picture frames shattered on the floor. Yet something about it didn't feel like a typical break-in. The officers did a quick sweep through each room. No one was hiding inside, and nothing obvious was missing. The television, laptop, even a gold watch on the nightstand, everything was still there. It looked like whoever broke in wasn't after money or valuables. The only thing gone was a small wooden box that Linda kept on her dresser. She explained it had belonged to her late husband, Daniel. It wasn't expensive, just sentimental. Inside were a few old letters, a photo, and a cufflink that had once belonged to him. Nothing that would make sense for a thief to take. The officers wrote their report, noting the lack of fingerprints or footprints. The ground outside was damp from rain, yet there were no clear tracks leading to or from the house. The door showed marks of being pried open, but that was about it. It almost seemed like whoever did it had been careful not to leave a trace. When the police left, they promised to patrol the area, but even they admitted it didn't look like an ordinary burglary. Later that night, Linda sat in her living room surrounded by the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of a clock. She tried to convince herself it was just random. Maybe kids, maybe someone looking for quick cash. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that the missing box wasn't taken by chance. Her husband's things had been untouched for years. No one else even knew about that box. As the hours passed, she kept replaying every detail in her mind: the open door, the mess, the one missing item. Something didn't fit. Maple Hollow was the kind of place where nothing ever happened, yet tonight it felt different, almost staged. She couldn't explain why, but she had the uneasy sense that whoever had come into her home had been looking for something. They had found exactly what they wanted. 2 days after the burglary, Linda woke to find an unmarked envelope in her mailbox. There was no name, no return address, only her own written neatly across the front. Inside was a single photograph. It showed the same wooden box that had been stolen, sitting on what looked like a dusty concrete floor. On the back of the photo was a date written in red ink: April 3, 2005. That was nearly 20 years ago. The sight of it made her chest tighten. She had no idea what the date meant, but she could tell it wasn't random. She called the police right away, her voice trembling as she explained what she'd received. Detectives arrived within the hour and studied the photograph closely. The picture was grainy, like it had been printed from an old camera. The wooden box looked aged, but unmistakably the same one that had gone missing. The detectives asked if the date meant anything to her. She shook her head, insisting she'd never seen it before. But the look in her eyes betrayed something deeper, something between confusion and fear. The officers took the photograph as evidence and told her to stay with a friend for a few nights. They didn't want her alone in case whoever sent it decided to come back. That evening, the detectives gathered at the station to review what little they had. A burglary where nothing valuable was taken, a missing box, and now a mysterious photograph tied to a date from years past. One of them dug through old local records, searching for anything significant about that day in 2005. What he found made the room fall silent. On that exact date, a man named Samuel Briggs had been reported missing in Maple Hollow. The case was never solved. It didn't seem like much at first, but when they looked deeper, they discovered that the private investigator who had handled the missing person case was none other than Linda's late husband, Daniel Parker. The coincidence was too sharp to ignore. Suddenly, the missing wooden box seemed less like a sentimental keepsake and more like a piece of evidence that had somehow been hidden for years. Detectives returned to Linda's home with more questions. She repeated that she didn't know what the photo meant and that her husband never spoke much about his work. But the detectives noticed something odd in the way she described him: admiring, yes, but guarded. She said Daniel had been a good man but kept certain files locked away even from her. He often worked late in the basement, and she never asked questions about the cases he took. It had been years since he passed, yet some part of him still felt present in the house, like he had left behind a secret she wasn't meant to find. After the police left, Linda sat alone again, staring at the copy of the photo she had made for herself. The date on the back haunted her. She tried searching it online, hoping it was nothing more than coincidence. But every mention of April 3, 2005 led to the same story: the disappearance of Samuel Briggs. That night, sleep wouldn't come easily. Each creak of the house made her heart race. The stolen box wasn't just a random target anymore. Someone wanted her to remember a part of her husband's past that had been buried for a very long time. Detectives could no longer treat the case as a simple burglary. The photograph and the date had turned a quiet investigation into a tangled mystery that stretched back to decades. They began pulling records related to the disappearance of Samuel Briggs. According to old reports, Briggs was a local contractor who vanished suddenly while working on a renovation project outside town. His car was found abandoned near a lake, the doors unlocked and keys still in the ignition. There were no signs of a struggle, no note, and no trace of him ever surfaced. The only person who had pursued the case after the police gave up was Daniel Parker, Linda's husband. In the station's dimly lit file room, the detectives found Daniel's name on a handful of witness statements. It was clear he had gone far beyond what was expected of a private investigator. He had tracked down former co-workers, visited Briggs's family, and even filed his own notes about missing evidence, but those notes were never turned over to police, and no one could find them now. It looked as though Daniel had been chasing something he either never found or didn't want others to see. When detectives returned to Linda's house to ask more questions, one of them noticed faint scratches on the bedroom floor where the stolen box had been. The marks were straight and deep, as if the dresser had been moved several times over the years. Out of curiosity, they pulled the dresser away from the wall. Behind it, they found a small wooden panel in the wall covered by a layer of paint that didn't quite match the rest of the room. After prying it open, they discovered a hidden compartment. Inside were two items: a torn photograph and a small, unmarked key. The torn photograph showed two men standing beside an old pickup truck. One of them was Daniel Parker, younger and smiling, but the other man's face was ripped away. The background appeared rural, with a barn and trees behind them, the kind of place found just outside town. The detectives bagged both the photograph and the key for testing. They sent the photo to forensics, hoping they could identify the second man through image enhancement or comparison to old files. While they waited for results, one detective decided to trace any remaining connections to Samuel Briggs. The address listed in his missing person report still existed, though the house had long been abandoned. What startled them most was realizing how close it was just 4 streets away from Linda's home. For years, she had been living within walking distance of the man her husband had once investigated. Back at her house, Linda seemed increasingly nervous as the investigation grew deeper. She admitted she had never been inside Briggs's old property, but said her husband sometimes went out for long drives in that direction late at night. She had assumed he was clearing his head after a long day of work. Now, looking back, those nights felt different. Detectives couldn't shake the feeling that everything tied back to that missing box. The hidden key suggested it opened something significant, and the torn photo hinted at a connection Daniel had tried to hide. The coincidence of Linda's house and Briggs's address being so close no longer seemed like chance. It began to look deliberate, as though someone had chosen that location for a reason. The case that started with a quiet burglary was beginning to unfold into a much darker story, one built on secrets, lies, and the long shadow of a disappearance no one had ever truly solved. The search of the old Briggs property began early on a misty morning. The house was crumbling, its paint peeled away by time and weather, windows shattered, and the roof sagging under years of neglect. Nature had started reclaiming it, vines crawling up the walls and weeds pushing through the cracked driveway. To most people, it looked abandoned beyond hope, but to the detectives, it felt alive with hidden history. The moment they stepped inside, the air turned colder, heavy with the smell of damp wood and dust. Every floorboard groaned beneath their feet as they explored what remained of a life left behind. They found signs that someone had been there recently, a few footprints in the dust, a broken padlock on the basement door, and faint light filtering through from below. When they descended the creaking steps, they discovered something chilling. In the far corner of the basement sat a wooden box that looked almost identical to the one taken from Linda's home. The same smooth finish, the same brass clasp, even the faint scratch on the lid that matched the description Linda had given. For a long moment, no one spoke. It was as if the missing box had found its twin. Inside, wrapped in layers of old newspaper, were several faded photographs. They showed Daniel Parker and Samuel Briggs together, standing near different buildings, examining documents, and in one image, standing in front of a dirt mound with shovels in their hands. The expressions on their faces were tense, not friendly. It looked less like a partnership and more like two men caught in a moment of confrontation. One photograph in particular drew the detective's attention. Daniel was looking directly at the camera, his eyes sharp and uneasy, while Briggs appeared to be pointing toward the ground. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that the two men had been involved in something far more serious than a private investigation. A deeper search of the basement turned up an old metal container buried under a loose floorboard. Inside were several files, all dated around 2005. The papers were brittle with age but still readable. They detailed a complex insurance scheme involving fake identities, falsified death certificates, and large sums of money. According to the documents, Briggs and Daniel had been partners in the operation. The plan had been to fake Briggs's death to collect a payout, but something must have gone wrong. The discovery painted a new picture. Daniel hadn't been investigating Briggs's disappearance, he had been part of it. The burglary at Linda's house began to make more sense. Someone must have known about the hidden evidence and wanted it before police could find it. The key hidden behind her dresser now seemed crucial, possibly belonging to a safe or storage unit tied to the scheme. As detectives gathered the files, they couldn't shake the eerie feeling that they were being watched. The wind moved through the broken windows with a low whistle, and the light from their flashlights flickered against the walls. The past, long buried, was clawing its way back into the present. Somewhere between the lies and the missing box was the truth about what really happened to Samuel Briggs, and it was beginning to look like Daniel Parker had taken more than just his partner's money. The fingerprint analysis on the wooden box came back a week later, and the results surprised everyone. The prints didn't belong to Linda, her husband, or anyone in the police database. They belonged to a woman named Ella Briggs, the daughter of the man who had disappeared 20 years earlier. She had no criminal record, no ties to Maple Hollow in recent years, and worked quietly as a nurse in a neighboring town. Detectives immediately reached out to her for questioning, hoping she could explain how her fingerprints ended up on an item connected to both her missing father and Daniel Parker. When they located her, she didn't run or deny it. She admitted to breaking into Linda's home but insisted she hadn't stolen anything for personal gain. Her voice was steady as she explained that she had recently discovered evidence linking her late father to Daniel Parker through old newspaper clippings and archived court documents. The name Parker Investigations kept appearing in connection with the unsolved disappearance. She believed that the wooden box held answers about what had really happened to her father. Someone, she said, had mailed her an anonymous photograph of that very box weeks before the break-in, along with a short note that read, "Find the truth before they do." She thought Linda might be keeping something hidden, so she took matters into her own hands. Her story raised more questions than it answered. Who had sent her the photograph? How had they known about the box? And if she wasn't responsible for the anonymous envelope sent to Linda, then someone else was still watching from the shadows. The police searched Ella's apartment and found the stolen box hidden under her bed. It was locked, the keyhole small and unfamiliar. When detectives showed her the small key found in Linda's wall, she said she'd never seen it before, but something in her expression shifted when she looked at it. She asked quietly if her father's body had ever been found. When told it hadn't, she closed her eyes for a long moment and said she wasn't surprised. The box was finally opened under police supervision. Inside were letters, photographs, and one signed confession written in Daniel Parker's handwriting. In it, he admitted that he and Samuel Briggs had staged the insurance fraud together, but after collecting the money, Daniel turned on his partner. He claimed Briggs had threatened to expose him, so Daniel lured him to a remote property under the pretense of dividing the funds. According to the confession, an argument turned violent, and Briggs never left that property alive. Daniel buried the evidence, kept the documents as protection, and started over with Linda, who he wrote knew enough to stay silent. When police confronted Linda with the confession, she didn't deny it. She said she had discovered the truth after her husband's death, but had never told anyone out of shame and fear of losing everything. The burglary had only brought back what she had spent years trying to forget. The confession confirmed that Briggs's death had never been an accident or a mystery. It was a murder disguised as a disappearance. The case that began with a simple burglary call had unraveled an entire history of deceit, greed, and betrayal. Linda was charged with obstruction of justice, while the remains of Samuel Briggs were later found buried behind the old property just where the photographs had suggested. The anonymous sender of the photographs was never identified, and no one ever claimed responsibility for setting the chain of events in motion. But in Maple Hollow, the quiet town where nothing ever happened, people still talk about the night a missing box exposed the truth that refused to stay buried.